Today, I wanted to talk about stage 2 and stage 3. Last night we talked about stage 1, and it was long because stage 1 includes proclaiming the gospel, but also welcoming someone in their first steps into a congregation. Stage 2 is discipleship, properly speaking, or catechumenate. And it's the longest stage because it goes on week by week by week. In a typical programmatic year, I would do the welcome of candidates sometime around Labor Day in September. And they would be meeting from Labor Day all the way till the first Sunday of Lent, more or less. And then I do the election. And then this stage 3, intense prep, takes place during Lent.
What do you show up in your if you were doing that rhythm, how do you handle the newcomer who comes in November?
You throw him in.
Who's in does she have to wait till the next?
No, you do the rite of welcoming because you can do it any Sunday for her, and you put her in the group right away. And the group deals with bringing her up.
I think that's important.
Okay. Now, if the person arrives the last Sunday of Epiphany, you're not going to give her a 1-week catechumenate before election. So there you say, well, no, we're going to start a program next fall. And, be flexible, though, because you might have a candidate or somebody whose catechumenate really doesn't have to be that long. I once had a catechumen who was a catechumen for a week and a half because she was dying. And quite sick. We baptized her in her deathbed, but we did the whole process for the sake of the congregation. I mean, I could have declared an emergency and baptized her on the spot, and but I wanted the congregation to own the fact that baptism isn't automatic. And I think we welcomed her 2 weeks before Palm Sunday. We elected her on Maundy Thursday, and we baptized her at the vigil in her bed. We did the vigil so we could all kind of stop to baptize her and keep going.
I've been amazed at how the group welcomes people, and I'll use our group as an example, the concrete experience. So I come in late, So yeah, you welcome me nice, Jerusalem welcomes me, but the real welcome happens at the table, and that's exactly what happens.
I just wanted people to hear that. It sounds very rigid otherwise.
Yes.
Yeah, and I'm using, for example, if you have no real catechumens, and you're not going to have a baptism at the vigil, but the bishop is coming on Pentecost, then you move the election to about 6 weeks before Pentecost. Okay, you don't necessarily have to do it on Lent 1. All right, let me go back and talk a little bit about discipleship proper, stage 2, which you were doing last night before you were elected this morning. I think it was Larry who said that the discipleship is the motor of the whole thing. It's this week by week reflection on your life in the light of Scripture, in community. Okay. A, these sessions week by week are not and should not be classes. And we did that very well. I didn't see anybody delivering lectures, okay, which is one of the temptations of the clergy, of course. And I'm terrible at this in a parish setting because I immediately want to give a talk about the meaning of everything. And what I do now is I just say, now I have a trained catechist now, I'll show up with a group, especially with Latinos, this is important. How nice that you all came, you're in great hands, let's say a prayer, and I bless them, and I get out. because they want my approval, right? But get out of the way. There will be a need for classes throughout. There's always someone who must read, who wants a book on theology, who has doubts about the Trinity. We had a catechumenate once who heard the story of the martyrdom of Perpetua, who went to the lions, knowing that she was abandoning her children. And she was horrified. She said, I could never abandon my children for the faith. Well, that allowed for a special talk by the rector on the role of reason in Anglican, and the Anglican conscience, respect for conscience, right? So she was assuaged. But I think it's better to wait until an issue rises and then talk to some expert and say, we would like to schedule a special talk about this. Do not schedule it at the same time and in the same place as the discipleship group. Do it Saturday afternoon, do it whenever. And the reason is you don't ever want to contaminate the Bible reflection group with intellectual lucubrations. Is that the word, lucubrations? Because once you start going that way, arguing about ideas, right, you've lost the whole purpose of the group. In these sessions, everyone is a teacher. And equally so, because everyone is an expert in their own life. So you want I statements, not you should, or you're wrong because, or you shouldn't be feeling that way. No, none of that. And because it's all, Larry alluded to it already, because you're doing it together, it's already a rehearsal of life in community. How to be vulnerable with people and learning to trust each other. Learning to disagree with someone, maybe, without necessarily having to fight it out, So the transformation is not only individual, but it's also community shaping. And this is why it's important for the participants to begin by knowing each other. That's why we did the bit early on. We didn't do it, but I mentioned it. This is who I am and this is how I got here. Which should begin I would do it about in here somewhere. When the priest meets with the people first time, for the first month. And this is why there are rules of the game, basically 4 rules. What is said here stays here. Confidentiality. Do not share what you do not wish to share. You're responsible for your own boundaries. You speak in I statements only. And all opinions have room at the table or in the room, whatever. No matter how contradictory they are. So Sally's feeling upheld by the Spirit, and Bob is feeling abandoned by the Spirit. That's just fine. It doesn't have to be reconciled. Okay. And as I said, this is generally the longest stage, and it happens week by week using the method that you have. The questions in the method I have developed over the years. The first ones I first got had no feeling of change in it, and eventually I ended up developing the question into what is God asking you to move towards? And when have you been in a similar situation? Rather than abstractly, what do you think the passage means? Because that's an invitation to theorize, Whereas if you keep going back to people's experience, they feel a lot more comfortable because they're experts in it. And you have no idea, of course, as the facilitator, about the experience that's going to come up. And so by doing that week by week, there are 4 main skills that inform the entire process that they begin to develop or hone. The first one is how to interpret Scripture. Very, very often, in fact, practically at every catechumenal group I've ever had, a few weeks into it, somebody says, I can't believe I'm in a church and no one is telling me what to think. It's a real shocker to them. So the idea that here's the text and you're supposed to make of it whatever is meaningful to you. If exegetical questions come up, we set up a meeting with the expert at another time, right? But the bread and butter of it is take the text and apply it to you. And I was observing in my own table over here that we had an entire conversation back and forth talking about people's deserts or wildernesses, people's angels, people's spirit-driven races, the deviations or no deviations in that movement to the desert. The entire conversation was being done in symbol and metaphor. And if a Martian had walked into that, they would have thought we were crazy because we were talking about, metaphors. The also very interesting thing too is that the ability to do that, to speak in metaphors, has nothing to do with your educational level. Illiterate immigrants can talk about their crossing of the Red Sea perfectly well. 6-year-olds have told me how the baby Jesus felt in Egypt with examples. He couldn't understand the language. He didn't have any more friends at school were different or non-existent, blah, 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 right? So it's a very flexible method to use even across cultures. Number 2, the other skill is to participate consciously and actively in worship. And we haven't done much of that because of time. But people will bring up examples of what worship means to them throughout in relation to the scripture reading. And just the act of doing that means that they're beginning to take responsibility for making sense out of their own worship experience. And so they're not just sitting there like a veg. Third, they begin to talk and develop personal habits of prayer and spiritual development or growth. And there, it's helpful to have a kit of suggestions, beginning with Our Father morning and evening, to daily office, to retreats, to reading, to invite a spiritual director to speak to the group, right, about development. And number 4, serving the poor and needy and working for justice and peace. When we put this, did I tell you this already? When we put this in the rites, the Bishop of Southern Ohio said, you can't put that in there because we don't do it. The Catechumenate assumes that a parish has some version of justice doing. Whether it's bringing sacks of food at the offertory or cooking at the local soup kitchen or whatever. And the disciple in the making also does that. So it would be, let's say over 6 months, the disciple joins a different justice work that's being done by the parish. And if there are several, it's better for them to visit them all so that they can begin to make a decision. And I would also add, they begin to develop a sense of vocation. I wouldn't wait until the very end to ask, what is God calling you to? God is calling the person all along. And it may be very early on that the person says, I have a problem with my career. And I'm seriously thinking of shifting careers. And there's an election going on there. a discernment process. And I think some of the skills that you taught us might be helpful at that moment, right? So eventually, over time, the BFL participant will start saying things like, I used to, but now right? I used to bite my fingernails, but now I find that I don't. If only. I used to go shopping nonstop and overload my credit cards, but I'm now learning to control my spending. There's a shift going on. It may be tiny, it might be huge. I used to let my husband beat me, but now I'm standing up to him and I need help. It could be along a very, very large gamut. That's a sign of conversion. Conversion is the proper word for that. You're being transformed in some area of your life. And not for intellectual reasons. You're being transformed here, in your habits, in your moods. The one in Puerto Rico just said to me, I used to hit my kids too much. And now I'm learning to respect them. Right? And when usually that happens before the rite of election, which is what tells you that people are ready for the rite of election, right? Because remember, if you use baptism as the model, baptism is the ritual enactment of a death and resurrection that's already beginning to happen. It's not a theological theory. It's an actual felt, lived, existential event in the person's life. I used to, but now I. And then getting buried in water and coming back out of that water is a dramatic and very moving cementing of that, as it were. Then you move on through election to the third stage, intense preparation. I call it intense preparation because it's a description of what it is, rather than Larry, help me here. What are the other names for that stage?
Some would call it a movement of purification.
Purification, or yeah.
This is what happens after the rite that we did
This morning.
Yes.
The rite of election begins stage 3.
And then we had that, and the rite of election is sometimes called rite of enrollment.
Enrollment, because you sign the name, right?
And that's actually what it says in the BOS.
Yeah, this can be election or enrollment. And it kicks off intense preparation. So that's why I said before, you want to do the rite of election about 6 weeks before the end date. Intense preparation should take about 6 weeks. So now in intense preparation, same rhythm of meeting. You meet every week, same time, same place. But the disciples are beginning to get a sense of what God is calling them to. And therefore, they're also getting a sense of the obstacles to that. In the ancient church, the obstacles were called demons, because they really believed there were demons flying in the air. And in the stars were demonic, and nature was demonic. So through reflection, prayer, serving the poor, almsgiving, and other personal practices, they begin to live in however small new ways into this thing that God is calling them to. Okay. And I think, again, the inventory, the vocation inventory that we just did before is very helpful towards the end of discipleship or the beginning of intense prep. Because you want to help them identify the obstacles. I'm afraid of talking to my boss about his pinching me in the butt, right? Or I can't stop smoking, whatever, And so it's a very appropriate exercise for Lent, although it doesn't have to be Lent. And the central image of it is our consciously walking towards God. The fathers of the church used to say that on the way to the font, the demons try to trip the catechumen from getting to the font. Because they get last-minute fears and, and temptations and hesitations and all of that. So identifying these obstacles is kind of important. And the obstacles are both individual and personal, but also societal. The homophobia of my people is preventing me from coming out of the closet. It might be very general like that, and it may have to, in order to be able to deal with it, you may have to bring it down to a gradual coming out, little by little, because the size of it is just too big. And it's also intense because, as I said, the fears show up. And therefore, the candidates need extra support. And here's where the sponsors really, really are important. You really should never do intense prep without sponsors. Because it's a lot like AA. It's a lot like, needing a call or someone to call halfway through the week when you're working on this stuff. So if you didn't pick sponsors earlier, you must pick the sponsors now. And this is a good moment to talk about sponsors. As I said before, there's no limit to the number of sponsors in any rite. You can have 15 if you want to. It's a good idea to always have one sponsor who's a member of the congregation, because the other ones may live far away or will just come to the baptism, whatever. Because of that, I don't think it's a good idea for the disciple to choose a sponsor. I think it has to be, I always ask the disciple first, who facilitated your belonging here? Tell me the people who helped you come to belong. And then, talking to the catechist, I would make the decision. Because I may know who's a dweeb, I may know who's a flake, I may know who's going to say, oh yeah, I'll do it, and never show up, right? So you want to pick a sponsor that's going to be mature, good with confidentiality, committed to the parish, and not crazy. Use your common sense. If you have catechumens, you may use year A, always, with the bishop's permission. And the reason is that the readings in year A are catechumenal, especially all through Lent. There are optional rites. For example, you can solemnly give the Our Father and the Creed to the catechumens in this period. And of course, the end of this stage is where the catechist should have a role in planning the liturgy that is coming here. Do not wait to tell the catechist on Holy Saturday night what they're going to do or how you're going to do the baptism. Get the catechist involved. The candidate doesn't have to know every single detail. It's kind of fun to keep some surprises in your pocket. For example, I once baptized 3 little boys. We got a kiddie pool. This is the Easter Vigil in a slum in Oakland, right? And everybody's standing there with candles. And the 3 kids get in the water, and we pour water over them. They were in their bathing suits. And then I pull out a horn full of oil. And I go glug, 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 glug. And those 3 kids immediately looked at me like, I'm king? Because they had discussed the story of David, right? Some things you don't have to explain if you prepare the candidate for scripturally for what's coming, and then the symbol works automatically. Well, that's enough for now about stage 3. Let me stop and ask if you have questions.